places where the Sioux Trail and the Hiawatha Pioneer Trail cross or are on the same road on Highway 19, just on the east side of Morton, Minnesota. The Sioux Trail is an old trail laid out in the 1920s. It travels from St. Paul to Mankato, following the Minnesota River on up to Ortonville. It goes on gravel or dirt and brings you as close to the Sioux conflict points of interest of any trail that you can take. It's truly a historic trail. The Hiawatha Pioneer Trail is a different setup. The oil companies found out years ago that if they laid out a historic trail and used taxpayers' money to develop them, they could increase the traffic on those roads not less than 25 nor more than 40% by just showing people places to go. If you're going to sell a lot of gasoline, you have to start in a high population area. The Hiawatha Pioneer Trail starts in Chicago. 8 million people in the Chicago area. And they go through the travel through states of Illinois and Iowa to the Come and See state of Minnesota. At the Come and See state of Minnesota, you enter at Jackson. Then up to Pipestone, the National Monument Memorial there. And then from Pipestone to Marshall to Granite Falls, just 30 miles west of here. And then it follows the Minnesota River down through Granite Falls, Redwood Falls, New Ulm, Mankato, St. Peter, and then on to St. Paul. The Hiawatha Pioneer Trail will always keep you on a hard surface road. It will get you as close as it can get to the points of interest, but always on a hard surface road. Vera Bradshaw laid this trail out. She was down to Cedar Rock Ranch many times, acquiring information of the points of interest. She put 21 points of interest on the first brochures, and of the 21 points of interest, 9 of them are within a half an hour's drive to an hour's drive of Redwood Falls. We will follow up with the Sioux conflict points of interest after viewing this highway markers here. This is the one area where the Sioux Trail and the Hiawatha Pioneer Trail are on the same steel post. Otherwise, they follow the route, but usually on a different road, a gravel or tar or something else, other than the being together on the same road. On the north side of St. Peter, Minnesota, Traverse des Sioux, at the crossing of the Sioux, the Indian and Red River trails up the Minnesota Valley cross to the north bank of the river and cut across the bend to the mouth of the Cottonwood. Here were fur trade and mission posts, and here on July 23rd, 1851, the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux was signed. At the same site, north of St. Peter, this is a bronze marking of the site of the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux, July 23rd, 1851. It was here that the delegation from Washington, D.C., along with the soldiers, came to get the Indians to sign, the Dakota Indians to sign the treaty here. Many of the tribes that were here were of the Sisseton tribe and the Wahpetons, and many of them were out hunting at the time, and so they did not have a full representation here for the signing of the treaty. The Indians did not want to sign the treaty, and of course the soldiers here first had erected a shade, for there were very few trees in the area at the time, but they did bring some poles and some branches so that this site was the signing actually took place in the shade underneath these branches and erected a little bit of shelter here. In order to get the Indians to sign, of course, they had cattle and they had provisions along with them, and they withheld of them until the Indians would sign. But then this wasn't working very well, and the people that benefited the most from the signing of the treaty were the traders. They were the big influence on the government and the soldiers and on the Indians, using all of their influence and their past friendship to get the Indians to sign a treaty, signing away all of their land to the Red River of the north and from Big Stone Lake down to the corner of Iowa and South Dakota. So that was the strong influence for these traders, benefited the most because they would extend credit to the Indians, and then knowing that this amount of money would be coming and they would get the annuities paid to them rather than to the Indians. The amount of the money that was allocated for the signing of the treaty was only to be used, the interest of this money was what was to be used. But the actual money, very little of it ever reached the Indians. It fell into the hands of the traders, and even the governor of the state of Minnesota was investigated for over a year, Governor Ramsey, before he was designated as not having anything to do with it, but everyone felt that he was just whitewashed and did get away with a lot of money. So that was what took place here, and they signed this treaty, and those that did sign, and they gave away all of this area in Minnesota except from just above New Ulm at Mud Lake Creek, halfway between New Ulm and Fort Ridgely, a 10-mile wide strip on each side of the Minnesota River, 20 miles in width, going parallel to the river at a slant from just above New Ulm to Ortonville, Minnesota. Then at a later date, in 1858 and 59, an attempt was made again to sign a treaty here, but it did not work out very well. So then the Medawankins, who were south of the river, did sign a treaty at a later date, hoping to get some of their food and clothing that they never got. And they finally signed this in St. Paul. So that took away the north side of the river and left the Indians with only the south side of the Minnesota River, 10 miles wide on each side. And of course here was established the Lower Sioux Agency at Morton, Minnesota, and then the Upper Sioux Agency up near Granite Falls, Minnesota. From there on, things got worse for the Indian by the year and by the day, and we finally wound up in the Great Dakota Conflict, one of the largest Indian wars in the history of the United States. No amount of bloodshed was greater in the United States. The dinosaur was here on the North American continent before the Ice Age. The horse was with the dinosaur on the North American continent before the Ice Age. We didn't know this until they built the Oahe and the Garrison dams. They found the bones of the horse and the dinosaur together in the deep core trenches in the Garrison and Oahe dams on the Missouri River. The dinosaur died because he couldn't move away from the cold and the ice. The horse went to Alaska and went on an 85-mile strip wide of bare land, and he walked from Alaska to Russia, for we had so much ice over Minnesota, 1 to 2 miles, that we tied up the ocean's water so much that we lowered the levels of the ocean so the horse could walk from America to Asia. And then some 400 years ago, he came over in a Spanish boat and was back to America again. And of course, this enabled the Indian then to live a great life with the horse, having him available to hunt the buffalo. Before that, they had to drive him over a cliff in order to get the buffalo and get all the good things that they got from the buffalo hide and his body for meat and his bones for all the use that they had for them. There were between 60 and 80 million buffalo on the Great American Plains. The buffalo provided everything for the Indian. He used the skin, he used the meat, he used the bones for tools, for raising corn. He just simply provided everything for the Indian. Once the Indian had the horse, he could then easily get the buffalo. So they had a lot of time to develop their culture and their way of life. And the buffalo was one of the key things providing their way of life on the North American continent here, which enabled the Dakota Sioux Indians to control over 5 states for well over 100 years here in this area here of Minnesota and on west. And of course the white man came along and started to take the buffalo for the meat. Then he took the buffalo for the hide, and finally simply for the heart, and finally just for sport, that he would kill the buffalo. There were hunters who could get 60 buffalo in one sitting. This is a nice buffalo bull here, and he would shoot the buffalo bull in the lung, and the bull would sit down and bawl. And then the cows, which we see off to the left, would circle around the bull, and then they would give the cow a deadly shot. Good hunters could get 60 buffalo in one sitting. The top buffalo hunter in the Great Plains here would get up to 120 in one sitting. So this is one of the main reasons that the Indians were willing to sign the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux in 1851, was because we had adopted the policy of General Philip Sheridan, and that was to destroy the Indians' food supply, the buffalo. This is why they agreed to settle on a reservation on each side of the Minnesota River from New Ulm on up to Ortonville, Minnesota. And of course they made the promise that they would get the food and the clothing, which would be a substitute for the buffalo way of life of the Indian. The Indian buffalo hunter also hunted on foot and with a spear before it became generally a wide use by him of using the horse. This was an Indian buffalo hunter. Hunting on foot. Hunting buffalo with a horse gave the Indian a terrific advantage. He gave him a lot of time to spend on his dances and his culture, and also for taking care of the meat. A typical Indian buffalo hunter, when shortly after the turn of the 1800s, in a series of treaties starting in 1801, 1851, and 1858, he was finally down first to 2 sides of the Minnesota River, from Mud Creek just above New Ulm to Ortonville, Minnesota, the headwaters of the Minnesota, and then finally down to 10 miles wide on the south side of the Minnesota River. Mostly the Metawankins lived on the south side of the river. It was General Philip Sheridan who said, "Let the buffalo hunters kill and skin until the buffalo is exterminated, for this is the only way they will defeat the Indian, by destroying his food supply. Little Crow was the leader of the Dakota Indians, the Sioux Indians, living in the Minnesota area. He was the leader of some 7,000 Indians. He was their chief, principally for the Metawankins on the south side of the river. T.J. Galbraith was the Indian agent at the time. His policy was the power of the government must be brought to bear upon them. They must be whipped, coerced into obedience. After this is accomplished, few will be left to put on a reservation. Many will be killed. More must perish from famine and exposure. And the more desperate will flee and seek refuge on the plains or in the mountains. A very small reservation should suffice for them. T.J. Galbraith, Indian agent. This is the back side of the Lower Sioux Agency building. This is an original building, 1861. This is where they administered the affairs of the Indians at the Lower Sioux Agency. The state of Minnesota bought the Lower Sioux Agency grounds. They put up a huge bronze lettered sign which said, "Here the savages attacked." This is what's left of it. They had to cut it down within 6 weeks because who were the savages? It was the Queen of England who put the price of 40 pounds on an Indian male scalp, 20 pounds on a female Indian scalp, 20 pounds on a 12-year-old boy's Indian scalp. It was us who taught the Indians scalping. The Indians didn't know what it was until we taught them scalping. This is on the Lower Sioux Agency front lawn. And of course they had to take a cutting torch and cut it down. In 1861, the road ran on this side, the front side of the building of the Lower Sioux Agency. Major Brown was the first Indian, one of the first Indian agents. He was a good Indian agent. He was replaced by T.J. Galbraith. We have to remember that the Civil War was going on at the same time. This was a political appointment. Lincoln appointed Galbraith to come up here and administer the affairs of the Indians. The good men were all kept to fight the Civil War. Only those undesirables were sent up here to administer the affairs of the Indians. T.J. Galbraith was a drunkard. He would trade an Indian maiden in for food that was theirs in the first place until the 4 missionaries that lived in this area said, "You really have no alternative but to fight." There were 4 missionaries, 4 missions in the area at the time of the uprising. The Riggs, and the Williams, and the Lacoparo, and the Bishop Whipple. Bishop Whipple was the youngest bishop in the United States. He was at the Lower Sioux Agency and will be going to the building that he served. Bishop Whipple's St. Cornelius Church. The church was started in the 1860s, and of course when the 1862 Dakota conflict came along, you'll find rainbow granite on the bottom part of the church. And then when the church was completed later in history, some 20 years later, after the uprising and after the Dakota conflict, then they used Sacred Heart red to complete the church. This is Bishop Whipple's Indian Mission Church. It was an English church, Episcopalian, St. Cornelius's church. And before the Indians did go on the uprising, they did ask the 4 missionaries, could this possibly be the same religion that you are teaching us, that the traders and the agents have? Because they could never understand the connection between the religion that the whites were trying to impose on the Indians and the terrible treatment that the Indians were getting from the white traders and the agent. Never once did the white people ask the Indians to be the same religion. At here it was Episcopalian. At Granite Falls it was Presbyterian. So it was described as one of the most sought after churches in this area. People that visit from Washington, D.C. do not ask where other churches are. They all want to come and see where the Bishop Whipple Church is here at the Lower Sioux community at Morton, Minnesota. When the Lower Sioux community was established, they attempted to teach the farmers to be farmers, the Indians to be farmers here. And they did have 640 acres in at the time of corn in at the time of the uprising. The women were taught the lace making. In this, the members, Indian women of this church here, are the only people in Minnesota that ever attracted English royalty from England to come and visit. For what they did, they were teaching the Indian women lace making. Now during the 4 sick days of the month, the Indian maiden spent that time in a separate tent, never in the family tent, those 4 days in a separate tent. And this is where these Indian maidens learned to be so good with their hands. They could sew moccasins watertight. But then when the lace industry was introduced here, then this became the world's best lace, and that's why the English royalty came over here to view the lace that these Indian people could make and the things that they could do with their hands. This was Good Thunder's gravestone marker. He was the first Indian to be baptized in this area. This is on the Bishop Whipple Church grounds. On the road, on the Sioux Trail in Renville County, going towards Major Brown's further in Gay Castle. Halfway between the Lower Sioux Agency and the Upper Sioux Agency is Major Joseph R. Brown's Further and Gay Castle. This is a view of it from the Sioux Trail Road. And here is where the castle was built. This is the remains of the foundation of a 13-room stone mansion. This was to be a huge cattle ranch. Major Brown, being a good agent ahead of Galbraith, the uprising may not have taken place had he continued in power. He no doubt made some money off of the Indians and administering their affairs there, and was able to build this beautiful 13-room stone mansion up here. This was the center of all social and political life in southwestern Minnesota prior to the uprising. The bronze plaque depicting what this 13-room stone mansion was actually like. Major Brown and Missionary Renville were having a friendly shooting match. An Indian maiden accidentally ran across their path of fire. She was hit by one of the bullets and she was wounded, and while she was recovering, Major Brown visited her at her bedside, fell in love with her and married her, and they had some 12 children here, and they started this castle in 1958. They started this castle before the uprising and having a huge cattle ranch up here, and had some 12 children with this marriage, the children being of mixed blood. And of course, when the uprising did hit here, she was able to save her children because she threatened them with the Sisseton Sioux. Major Brown was away from home at the time. She said the Sisseton Sioux warriors would have a reprisal against them, for the decree of the Indians was that all half-breeds and all whites were to be killed. Renville, who was with Brown, was no doubt one of the more intelligent persons that ever set foot in this area. He was the son of a French fur trader up in the Red River Valley, and he lived with his mother, and then at the age of 12 it was discovered that he was a genius and he could recite a sermon after he heard a minister give it. So his fur trading father took him to Canada, and under a French priest he tutored him, and he became one of the most sought after men in Minnesota, for he had both worlds. He had the Indian life and the white man's way of life, and it was through him that the Bible was translated into Sioux. Major Brown brought a piano and a sewing machine up here by ox cart from St. Paul. That sewing machine, parts of it, and the parts of the piano are in the Morton Museum today. So they had a wonderful life scheduled for him up here until the August 18th, 1962 outbreak of the Dakota conflict, which ended their life up here in the burning and looting of this place here. This is a view from the site of Brown's Castle, where he could overlook the Minnesota River Valley and view his cattle ranch that he was having here. There are several books that included this area, and one of them is Minnesota, the Forgotten River by Evan Jones, and the other one was Circle of Trees by Dana Farilla of Rome, Italy, and also Birch Coulee by Bernard Francis Eder also wrote of the social and political life that they had up here at Brown's Castle. It was a gay place. It was called Further and Gay Castle. Major Brown was promoted many town sites. Brown County was named after him, Brownsville, but he also was the inventor of the steam tractor. For in this area of the valley here, it's above Patterson Rapids, and Patterson Rapids stopped all steamboats from coming up the Minnesota River Valley, so we had the greatest expansion of land between here and the Missouri River of any place in the world. So therefore, he was going to solve the transportation problem by pulling wagon trains from Redwood Falls west. He did establish stage lines from Redwood to Lind and to Sisseton. He did get his steam tractor as far as Henderson, Minnesota, but then due to the weight of it and all of the sloughs, the project was abandoned because no roads to run the tractor on. Renville, being one of the more intelligent missionaries that traversed and visited Brown here, Renville County was named after missionary Renville, and so was the city of Renville, Minnesota. From this point west was one of the best fur trading parts of the state, and from here west it was Lady Astor in New York City that gained her fame and fortune from the fur trade from the Minnesota River on up through Marsh Lake and Lac Oparo to the west of here. So the Indians were always involved in delivering furs and trading them to the whites from here to the only building, the only original building still standing on the Upper Sioux Agency grounds. This was the employees' office here and their residence. And the Upper Sioux Agency was built at a cost of $400,000. You could do everything here. You could put people in prison right over here. Farther behind this, you could saw lumber. You could bake bread. You could make horseshoes. There wasn't anything you couldn't do up here. Over to the east of us here was the horse barns. Way over to the east of us here is the original horse barns. During the uprising, one of the cannonballs passed through the horse barn. The Yellow Medicine River and the Minnesota River meet right here where the agency headquarters are. This is the Yellow Medicine in the background over here. Yellow Medicine River, view of the Yellow Medicine River. The Annuity Center was located here. It was the largest and most important building in the complex of the Upper Sioux Agency. It was the warehouse, and the annuity goods were stored within it before being issued to the Indians. It also contained the offices of the agent, his assistant, and the doctor. The two-story brick structure measured 105 feet in length by 33 feet in width. Built in 1959, it was severely damaged by the fire during the Sioux Uprising of 1862. Its ruined walls were finally torn down in the 1870s. Over here we see the foundation of the old warehouse. And of course in the background were the horse barns over there where cannonballs passed through during the uprising. And again, it was a self-contained community built at a cost of $400,000. Being able to bake bread, put people in prison, build wagons, saw lumber, there wasn't anything you couldn't do up here. Make horseshoes for the horses. Had their own blacksmith shop. Everything a complete, total community. This was prior to the uprising. Boiling Springs, halfway between the Upper Sioux and the Lower Sioux agencies. Boiling Springs was the historic Boiling Spring, 250 yards northwest, was long an Indian camping place and later a watering spot on the Fort Snelling Dakota Road built in the 1850s. The road turned here to pass the spring, then called Big Spring Settlers, renamed it for the steamy effect created in winter by the bubbling water. Patterson Rapids, Delhi Township on the Minnesota River in Redwood County. As early as 1783, Floyd Patterson had a trading post here just below this rapids. This rapids stopped all the steamboats. Early farmers that were in this area got paid for carrying rocks out of the Minnesota River Valley so the steamboats could come up here this far. They were paid $1 a day. So this is the rapids that caused Major Brown, one of the first Indian agents and a good Indian agent, to invent the steam tractor. It was from this point west, from Redwood Falls west, the end of the steamboat line, that he was going to have the huge wagon trains pulled behind this steam tractor. And of course he started out at Henderson, run into sloughs, and the whole project failed. But as early as 1783, just below this dams, Floyd Patterson, establishing his fur trading business, For it was at this point that many of the Indians coming down the river here would see their first white man, for they were told about the fact that they could trade their furs and get money and goods for them at this point here. For above here was one of the best fur trading countries in the area. The Lac-qui-Parle area had a lot of furs in those low-lying marshy flats up in the Lac-qui-Parle area. So the Indian would come down the river here in his canoe, meet Floyd Patterson here, and below the dam they would trade their furs, and they would be put on boat here and heading for the eastern coast. Lady Astor, of Lady Astor fame, many of you know her for her face cream. She obtained her wealth here out of the fur business on the Minnesota River here, from here west. These rocks are a part of the old chain of mountains that extended through the center of Minnesota, and of course when the glacier washed through here it exposed these rocks, but because this stopped the steamboats here, we had one of the greatest expanses of land in the world with no water transportation, and you had to go way out to Bismarck, North Dakota before you would again get on the Missouri River and have some water transportation. So this was the one and only route that the Indians from the western part of the area here could get their furs out to the New York and the European market. These rocks were one of the main causes of the greatest Indian war in the history of our nation. For it was the long hair, or the blanket Indians, who lived above this rock rapids, and he was not exposed to all of the things that the white man had. For on the steamboat you could bring the Bible and the beer, the good and the bad, up on the steamboat. But from here west, everything had to go either on wagon or by horseback or on foot or by canoe. So it was these Indians that lived above here, mostly the Santee that lived above here, who did not want to accept the white man's ways, and they chose this valley because it had the rich furs and the wood and the springs, many little lakes along the river here, which enabled them to have a good life. It was below this dam that Charles Patterson in 1783 had built his fur trading post below the dam here, and of course then he had water transportation to take the furs on to the east. The area is located halfway between the Lower Sioux and the Upper Sioux Agency. The upper portion of Rice Creek Falls. Creek Falls is more than a city block long, flowing over a series of granite outcroppings. It was here that the Rice Creek Indians, the long hair or the blanket Indians, chose to live. They were beyond the end of the steamboat line. This is where Red Middle Voice was a part of Little Crow's Sioux Nation. And it was described that there wasn't even a gopher left on the prairie here to eat. So it was 4 warriors from this camp that went up to Hutchison, Action Township, and on a dare, when they were starving, one of them said, "You do not even dare to take this egg or this chicken, yet your family is starving." The other warrior said, "I will take the egg and the chicken, and on top of that, I will kill the family that owned it." So they went up to the farm place there and engaged the white family in a friendly shooting match, quickly reloaded their guns, and when the whites had emptied their guns, of course, they killed the family that was up there. They raced their 4 ponies back here to Rice Creek Falls. And of course, this was their camp here. And they had food, they had water, they had small game, they had protection from the wind. They had everything they needed here. They wanted only for the whites to get out of this country and for the Indians who had 30,000 years of experience of living on the North American continent to have it back the way they had it before the whites come. So after this incident, and they told Chief Middle Voice what had happened, then Chief Middle Voice knew that the $50,000 in gold that had left St. Paul, that he didn't know about, but it had left St. Paul, and it was as far as Fort Snelling, but that payment was way late. They did have 640 acres of corn planted east of it here, but the crops were poor, and all the Indians shared with each other. They had nothing to eat. Described as the buffalo is gone, and not even a gopher left on the prairie to eat. So he knew if the gold did come, after his family, after his warriors had killed a white family of settlers, that he would get none of the annuities anyway. So in the middle of the night on August 17th, they went up to Little Crow's Indian farmer home, got him out of bed, called him a coward often enough until he finally agreed to go on the uprising. And of course you want to remember that at the time of the uprising, the payments were coming from St. Paul, so the traders again were handing out free whiskey to the Indians. So when we tell you later what the Rice Creek Indians did, then it was only while they were drunk. So after the warriors who had been up and convinced Little Crow to come back to go on the uprising, then they come back here on August 18th to the Rice Creek Indian camp, and from here they started out on the war. And of course they had free liquor, so that they were not themselves when they started out here. They headed for the first killing after the war, which would be the Swant Memorial across the river from Rice Creek. Prior to this, Inkpaduta, a renegade Indian chief living in Big Stone City, South Dakota, had attacked Lake Chautauqua and Spirit Lake. That was not a part of this uprising. That was just a massacre ahead of the uprising. So once this decision was made here, then they went on the greatest Indian war in the history of the United States. From 600 to 1,000 white people killed in this area, not knowing how many Indians. Rice Creek Falls is in Delhi Township, Redwood County, near the small town of Delhi. The Swant Memorial, Renville County, Flora Township, right across the Minnesota River from Rice Creek Falls, where the decision was made to go on the Sioux Uprising. You have to remember that Lincoln was about to lose the Civil War, so the $50,000 in gold was late in coming from from St. Paul, but the traders knew that it had left, and it was at Fort Snelling. The settlers in this area were very, very good people. The Indians were very, very good people that lived in this area, but of course the traders were the scoundrels of the whole outfit. So they are the ones who passed out the liquor to the Indians. So when I tell you what happened here, then you have to remember that the Indians had received all this liquor from the traders and were not responsible for themselves for their acts. So this is one of the worst crimes in recorded history. If you look in the movie of The Immigrants, then you will see the scene in there of the bare-bellied woman expecting a child. For it was here, it is reported in our history books, but written by the white people, that they cut an expectant mother open alive and nailed the child to a tree, and she watched it die. They wanted to make this so gruesome that the whites wouldn't return here for 10 years. They took the men and they beheaded them and disemboweled them, placed the head in the hands of the cavity of the stomach. So this is what later in history caused the city of New Ulm to put all their women and children in the basement of Eibner's Cafe and ordering one woman to blow them up rather than to fall into the hands of the Indians. Mary Swant survived the entire ordeal here from August 18th to September 26th, where she was released at Montevideo, Minnesota. One of the girls did have a rifle ball pass through her stomach. It is reported she was raped for 4 days before she died. Another 11-year-old girl kept her baby brother alive on the milk of corn in the fields here until the whites were able to rescue him at a later date. Many of the white women in this area lived in a ravine for as high as 24 days, taking their apron strings to strangle the family dog so he wouldn't yelp, and let them know where they were hiding so that the Indians would find them. After the Indians sobered up, then they never did this type of thing. They only killed the man and told the women and children, New Ulm, and to get out of here, which is what they did. The Middle Creek Church, a German community and settlement. Many of the early Germans came here to escape the tough military, German-Prussian military type of life in Germany, came as early settlers. When the uprising, this is located in Flora Township in Renville County, and it is a short distance from the Swant Memorial. Of the 75 people in the congregation, 72 were killed in their homes, in the fields, wherever they could find them. Just one of the many gravestone markers of the settlers near the Middle Creek Church that died in the Dakota conflict of 1862, August 18th, 1862. More of the many monuments in memory of the settlers that were killed around the Middle Creek Church. This is east of the Middle Creek Church. Mrs. Henderson and her 2 daughters, and Eugene White. The Radnor Boys marker, east of the Middle Creek Church. It was easy for the Indians to spot a wagon fleeing from the massacre sites in this area. For Renville County, one of the finest counties in the state, a treeless plain, a high lime area where less than 6 trees will grow here because of the 8 points of lime, where a Norway pine cannot stand more than 5. So this was a treeless, open plain, excellent land, little change in elevation. So it was easy for the Indians to spot the wagons fleeing the area, for they could see them for miles here. Renville County, the elevation doesn't change more than 100 feet in 7 miles. So it was here that the Indians caught up with the Radnor family, and the Radnor boy, being 16 years old, had rocks in his gun. He had powder in his gun, jumped out of the wagon, fired enough rocks at the Indians to hold them back enough so that his family could escape. But of course he lost his life in doing so. And this monument was put up in memory of the bravery of the Radnor boy, 16 years old. This represented what happened in southwestern Minnesota. For in a 21 county area of southwestern Minnesota, within 3 days' time, if you're white or a half-breed, you were either out or killed. The attack on the Lower Sioux Agency was also made on August 18th, 1862. Lind was one of the first ones killed here. He was a trader in the area, and he had married an Indian woman and of course had deserted her. This is one of the reasons they killed him first. The traders' posts were very close together here, just outside of the agency headquarters. Myrick is the one trader. When the Indians were asking for food or for credit, knowing that their gold was coming, Myrick told them to go eat grass. Grass was a polite word in the history book for human waste. They found Myrick on the 18th with the so-called grass in his mouth. Another one of those taking advantage of the Indian, selling him goods and food, exorbitant prices, and then getting their payment from the government when the annuities would come. The Indians never receiving the payments. The Indians made a clean sweep here at the Lower Sioux Agency, wiping out all the trading posts and all the personnel at the Lower Sioux Agency. Either they were killed or they had fled. They had fled, hopefully, across the Redwood River Ferry. All of these traders were located near the agency building, which was looted. It was not burned. It's one of the few buildings that was not burned in southwestern Minnesota. But it was looted, and most of the personnel was killed or they fled. Chief Wabashaw's Indian campground. He was farther east from the Lower Sioux Agency. He did not readily engage in the uprising as quick as the Rice Creek Indians, but once word spread by the Indians how easy the whites were to kill, these other camps did enter into the uprising, increasing the number of warriors that were able to attack Fort Ridgely. The Redwood Ferry was below this point at the Lower Sioux Agency. It was here on August 18th that Captain Marsh thought all he had to do was come up here and quiet a few Indians who had been given too much whiskey by the traders in their effort to beat them out of their annuities. And of course, when Captain Marsh came out here, he had found out that he had a full-scale war on his hand, and he lost his life, and some 23 of his men out of the 46 were killed. The others were able to get back to Fort Ridgely, some 13 miles downstream. So it was here that they found out that they had a full-scale war on their hand rather than just a small little skirmish. Fort Ridgely, overlooking the Minnesota River Valley south of Fairfax, Minnesota. Foundations of the soldiers, officers' barracks in the foreground, the museum in the background. Monuments for the Battle of Birch Coulee. Foundation of the doctors' living quarters on the Fort Ridgely battlegrounds. With 500 warriors on August 20th, 1862, in the afternoon the Indians attacked Fort Ridgely. Our soldiers did have a cannon, fired into the barn and the store that they'd taken, setting them on fire, and the Indians retreated because they were not used to combating with a cannon. The war was getting popular with the Indians. Those who had shrunk back from joining the forces now joined in. And on August 22nd, they attacked again with 1,200 warriors. But our soldiers, again using the cannon, were able to repel them. And of course the Indians decided they didn't need Fort Ridgely anyway. Their main object was to move on to New Ulm. Foundations of the officers' quarters at Fort Snelling. All of these sites are at Fort Ridgely. This is the soldiers' barracks, foundation of the soldiers' barracks at Fort Ridgely. Monument at Fort Ridgely in memory of those who fought in the Battle of Fort Ridgely. The Indians then moved on to fight the Battle of New Ulm. Fort Ridgely State Park. Harkin's store had a 10,000 bushel elevator below the store here on the Minnesota River, where they had steamboat traffic to carry the wheat from Brown, Redwood, Lyon, and Lincoln counties. It was hauled here by wagons. Sometimes as many as 100 wagons were tied up here to deliver their wheat to Harkin's store. Corn and oats for sale here at Harkin's store. Besides a general store, it was also the post office in the area. The store was operated by the Harkins family before the uprising. Grandfather Harkins was 4 years old at the time of the uprising. His family was killed. Some of the people here left in a buggy and fled the area, and some did escape. Grandfather Harkins was left in a pig pen with a gash in his head. They thought he was dead, but he recovered later and operated the store in this area. His granddaughter, Janet Massapust, operated the store and allowed people in here for 25 cents and then later for 50 cents to tour the building. She was an old maid school teacher in Redwood County at one time. She would show where they had a newspaper here of the crowning of Queen Victoria printed in gold ink. They had morphine on the counter, sold like we sell aspirins today. And this would keep, in her words, would keep the babies quiet when they would have a Saturday night dance at one of the neighbors, give them a pinch of morphine. And of course this was the babysitter, not realizing it was a drug. They had shoes with no left and right on the counter here. All of the ammunition and some of the mail were left here at the time of the uprising. This was the center of all trading in this area and for points west from here at the time of the uprising. The Minnesota River Valley near Harkin's store. An early town of the 1860s in Brown County near Harkin's store. The Milford Monument The Milford Monument was erected in memory of the people who lived in the town of Milford, Minnesota. 80 people in one common grave here. They were massacred August 18th, 1862. The statue here is so good that you can see the blood veins in the hands of the woman depicting the memory of those who were massacred. August 18th, 1862. On the afternoon of August 19th, the Indians had attacked the town of Milford and had killed and looted the whole town, and there were some 80 people buried at the town of Milford, west of New Ulm. About 100 Indians came into New Ulm also on August 19th and attempted to loot and kill here. They had destroyed many of the buildings in town, but they were not able to pass some of the barricades that were put up in town. On August 24th of 1862, 600 Indians viciously attacked the city of New Ulm and almost conquered the city. A rainstorm come along and got the Indians powder wet, so this enabled the citizens of New Ulm, gave them a breather. The Indians couldn't fire their guns, and then they were evacuated from here to Mankato and to St. Peter after the Indians were unable to fire. There was a gallant battle on the part of the German settlement of New Ulm to ward off the Indians at this time. Some 34 of the citizens of New Ulm were killed on August 24th in the battle. The old Eibner's Cafe, where the women and children were put in the basement of this building during the time of the uprising. During the uprising, the people of New Ulm who had heard of the atrocities up at Swamp Memorial put all the women and children in the basement of this cafe and put powder kegs amongst them and was going to blow them all up rather than let happen to them what had happened in the first uprising incidents up by Rice Creek and the Swamp Memorial. A few days, soldiers come in. They had put all the women and children here and put powder kegs amongst them and fused it, put a woman in charge. She was to blow them all up rather than let them fall into the hands of the Indians. Twice the soldiers come in and told her to light the fuse. She refused and wound up saving all the women and children of the city of New Ulm, and of course they evacuated the next day. Roadside historic marker for the Battle of Birch Coulee. It was here that the 152 soldiers were sent up here to bury the people that were on the prairie here. They were bloating, laying out on the prairie. We're talking about September 2nd of 1862, and the war started on August 18th of 1862. So these people had been laying here, bloating in the sun by the hundreds. Now the Indians' powder got wet at New Ulm, so they lost the battle down there, or the power to take New Ulm. The whites were being organized and pushing them back into this area. So as the soldiers came up here, 152 of them, they circled their wagons in this huge open area here and made camp here. No water here, but they had only the water that they carried with them. So then the Indians accidentally found them and engaged them in battle. And they fought here for some 36 hours. During that fight, then they had 70 horses, and they shot their own horses and shot them in between the wagons in the huge circle, just as you see it in the movies, and laid down behind their horses trying to save their own life. Now, if you read the book Birch Coulee by Bernard Francis Eder, he tells of the Indian maiden that came from the coulee over there where the Indians were and had good cover, and how she ran across the path of fire to tell one of her soldier boy lovers that the attack was going to take place, and of course the Indians shot her as she ran across the prairie there. Now, when the battle was over, there were less than 10 men that could stand up and fight. 90 were wounded, and had not help come from Fort Ridgely, this would have been another Custer's last stand. When they arrived here, out in the center of this area, they saw Justina Krieger. She had had her clothes ripped off of her. Her family was gone. She was standing out here in a daze. And they put her in the only standing wagon out in the center of this field here. And when the battle was over, they counted 200 holes in the box, yet none happened to hit her. So the soldiers then took her along back to New Ulm, and when she got to New Ulm, she found all of her family. The neighbors had taken her children, except her youngest baby. And so she was reunited with her children. Some years back, Kathy Schimmel, a school teacher from Renville, I had taken them on tour, and after I showed them this scene, she brought a 12-year-old girl forward from Renville and said, "This is a descendant of Justina Krieger." This is Birch Coulee, just to the east of the battlegrounds. The Indians had a terrific advantage here. They had wood, water, and cover to protect themselves, while the whites were out in the open without water for 36 hours. The Birch Coulee monuments are overlooking the Minnesota Valley. This monument was erected in memory of the 52 soldiers that lost their life in the Battle of Birch Coulee, fighting for 36 hours before they died. The battle was a very long, hard battle without food or water. These monuments were erected here because this was the center of all Renville County life at one time. All of the horse racing and the games and the fairs that they had were once on the fields just to the northeast of this monument. The monument was erected in memory of those who fought for what they thought was right, the Indians who were loyal to the whites. Remain loyal to the whites. They were starting to accept the Christian ways of living with the white man. This was erected in memory of them. A third monument was to be erected here in memory of those who fought for what they thought was right, Little Crow and his men. We have never put up a monument in memory of our enemy. This monument was never started or completed, yet it was funded by our legislature. After the Battle of New Ulm, then the whites were getting organized to retaliate against the Indians. Before this time, the word was spread amongst the 1,200 warriors how easy the whites were to kill. But of course, when the Indians' powder got wet at New Ulm and they could not fire their guns, then after they had retreated from New Ulm, Sibley was organizing troops to follow them up. And of course, these troops, their parents were educated in Europe, but these young fellows could not read and write. And they tied straw to one leg and hay to the other leg to teach them left and right, trying to make an army out of them. Now, Sibley proceeded up the Minnesota River Valley towards Wood Lake. And as he did so at Wood Lake, Little Crow was in charge of the Indians up here, and they had laid a trap for Sibley and his soldiers. But because our soldiers were so poorly trained, they accidentally pre-sprung the Indians' trap. For we know that in the Civil War, more soldiers died of the diarrhea than from bullets. Blackberries were a cure for the diarrhea. Our soldiers were out scrounging for food and blackberries to stay in good health. This way they pre-sprung the trap laid by the Indians, and so only 41 of our soldiers were wounded and killed up here, whereas this may have been another Custer's last stand. But also at this point, Sibley, with enough forces now and a messenger to Little Crow, was able to tell him that he was hopelessly lost and should give up. So then they proceeded on up to Montevideo, Minnesota, to Camp Release. There were two incidents that happened up at the Upper Sioux Agency, one being before the uprising, when the Indians came here and demanded their food, and Galbraith was up here negotiating with them, and he had foreseen that something was wrong and there was a lot of unrest, so he did have 125 soldiers up here with him. And of course then the Indians simply could not negotiate with him, so they went into this warehouse here and took their food, started taking their food and clothing. We did have the soldiers here with a cannon for the first time. The Indians were afraid of a cannon, so they did back out when our soldiers wheeled the cannon into the warehouse door. Then the soldiers pleaded with Galbraith, the drunken Galbraith, the soldiers overruled him and did give the Indians some of their food and clothing, and then they left. Then after the uprising started, of course this was attacked and burned and looted. Peter Patrol, a storekeeper up here, had a rifle ball pass through his body. He headed for St. Paul, but he got lost. He had a box of crackers is all he had on the way. He wound up in St. Cloud. No one could ever figure out how the man with a wound through his body like that and a box of crackers could make it clear to St. Cloud. That's the only building left at the Upper Sioux Agency. Near Camp Release, the Lacopara Mission, 1835 to 1854. Established at the request of missionary Renville. Located on the Upper Minnesota, one of the finest fur trading areas, fur producing areas in the state. The Lacopara Mission. The first church bell ever to ring in the state of Minnesota is inside this mission church. It was here at Camp Release where the Indian lost so much. He lost his hope. The white man had destroyed his pride, denied him his culture, and then we set up barriers so he could not blend into the white man's society. This was a short war up here. It started on August 18th, 1862, down by Rice Creek at the Swant Memorial. Then it entered into the battle, massacre at the Lower Sioux Agency, the Fort Ridgely battle, and then on to New Ulm. And of course at New Ulm, things started to turn. Up until that time at New Ulm, the Indians were spreading the word that it was so easy to kill the white men. But after the Battle of New Ulm, when the Indians' powder got wet, then Sibley was organizing forces to drive them back. He drove them up the Minnesota River here towards Camp Release. Prior to that time, Little Crow and his people had picked up 269 white women and children. Mary Swant, from the very beginning, survived the entire ordeal of the Dakota conflict. Little Crow made a huge circle to the north in Renville County, then towards Fort Ridgely, then towards New Ulm, taking the 269 white women and children as captives, going around by Lake Chautauqua, and then on up here towards Wood Lake, and on up to Montevideo, Minnesota at Camp Release. Now a lot happened up here at Camp Release. Little Crow, on September 26th at the Battle of Wood Lake, after he had lost that, sent messengers. It was not Little Crow, it was the Indians who were friendly to the whites, who made the negotiations with Little Crow and the whites that they would release the 269 white women and children here up at Camp Release. So on September 26th, we had made the promise to the Indians that they would get their food and clothing, and as they came into, and that nothing would happen to them. But as they came into camp, we put them in chains and held court here. We held court here. A 6-year-old boy was pointing the finger at the Indians that were to be hung. Sibley was a Democrat. He wanted out of this, but he didn't know how to handle the people of the state of Minnesota, for all they wanted was the Indians dead. He contacted his good friend, Republican Governor Ramsey. Ramsey wanted nothing to do with this. So they contacted Lincoln, and Lincoln asked all that we produced was proof. We produced proof on 2, but he accepted it on 39. Now Bishop Whipple almost lost his life, for he dared to go to Lincoln at the height of this conflict and ask for a reprisal. He got a reprisal from the 400 down to 39. Now they ran out of food up here at this Camp Release, so they went on to Morton, Minnesota. There's a granite block down there that tells you that the court-martial was held there again, and it was there that it was put down to 39. One more had died of the warriors, had died of his wounds, so they went on to New Ulm to conduct a hanging. German women who came, the warriors who were chained to wagon wheels, were attacked by German women who had lost their husbands and their sons and their brothers in the Battle of the New Ulm, come out and attacked and cut at the body parts of warriors chained to wagon wheels. Sibley ordered fixed bayonets, took the Indian warriors to be hung, the 38, onto Mankato, and September 26th, the day after Christmas, we conducted the nation's largest mass hanging. Now, all of the bodies were put in a grave along the banks of the Minnesota River, for it was frozen then and the sand was easy to dig in. Dr. Mayo of Mayo Clinic fame wound up with the body of Cut-Nose, who he had had a fight with out on the prairie. I had a doctor on tour once who wrote his thesis on the bones of Cut-Nose in the Big Black Kettle at Rochester, Minnesota. All the other bodies were stolen by doctors, which gave Minnesota a jump on the rest of the world in medicine, for they were able to examine and study and cut away at the parts of the 38 Indian warriors, and this gave us a tremendous advantage in the medical world in the rest of the world. Now, that took care of the 38 Indians who were hung at Mankato, which was our largest mass hanging ever in the United States. Another 1,200 Indians up here at Camp Release decided that the buffalo were gone on the Dakota Plains. It was certain starvation. Knowing very likely they would be hung, they went over into the soldiers' camp during the night, and there they were, and the soldiers then took them on to Mankato and to Fort Snelling, half of them at each place. By this time, wealthy widows in New York City were demanding congressional investigations on the treatment of the Indians by the Minnesota people. They were saying that we were giving them inhuman treatment. So a congressional investigation showed at the prison camp at Mankato that we intentionally took 4 smallpox-infested blankets into camp, knowing very likely that they would get the smallpox and would perish from this disease smallpox. In the spring of 1863, we took what was left of the Mankato camp and those at Fort Snelling and put them on a steamboat down the Mississippi to St. Louis, Missouri. At St. Louis, Missouri, we put them in low-draft steamboats and shipped them up the Missouri River. We decided to put them in small camps out in the west to make them weak, like Hitler and Stalin did with Germany, to divide them up so they could never fight again. Most of us know about the Battle of Wounded Knee out west, where our soldiers eventually put 136 Indians into one mass grave. Few of us know about the Battle of Sand Creek. These are the 1,200 Indians that we're talking about, what was left of them. At the Battle of Sand Creek, our soldiers were again on a battle count type of mission. They did go out at Sand Creek and attacked a camp of women and children while the men were away hunting. And as evidence of their battle count by congressional investigation, they came back with the female organs of Indian women stacked on their saddle horns. This left another 5,000 Indians at Camp Release. Very proud Indians who were what was left of the 7,000 originally living in this area, in the Renville and Redwood County areas. And these 5,000 Indians, knowing that the buffalo were gone and that they would face starvation out there, decided to go out and join up with Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull are some of the best generals in the United States today, or at that time, and their tactics are taught at West Point today. They were in the Black Hills area, which was sacred ground forever until we found gold there. Then, of course, those rules were changed. A little later in history then, with these 5,000 Indians out there with their cousins, the Hunkpapas and the Brules under Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. Then Custer was told that if he had one winning battle, he would be President of the United States. So he took camera crews with him, even way back then, and set out, and where all others had failed, he outfitted his soldiers in buffalo coats, fur coats, and overshoes. He waited for 20 below weather, and then again by congressional investigation, he would attack an Indian camp and drive them out on the prairie and burn and loot their camp. By congressional investigation, they found as many as 9 Indian babies stuffed inside of a slaughtered horse trying to survive the cold of the night. Custer was not satisfied with this. He was determined to go ahead. Custer always had an Indian mistress with him, John Crooks, who played the piano for 54 years, the organ at the Episcopalian Church in Morton, Minnesota, as a descendant of Custer and one of these Indian mistresses. So then Custer would not wait for his supporting generals of Reno and Gibbons. He went on wanting all the glory himself, got himself out too far, and of course at the Little Bighorn he was attacked by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse and the Renville and Redwood County Indians, the Dakota Indians of Minnesota. They fought with such ferocity that, of course, all of us know the story how they annihilated the Custer's entire troop. The only living thing left out of Custer was his stallion, for the Indians never killed the leader of the leader's horse, for that was supposed to be one of the best horses in the country. So then the steamboat Far West, they put that stallion on there. They put the wounded men of Reno and Gibbons, although they had been in skirmishes on the side. So just below the Little Bighorn, the fastest trip in the United States ever by a steamboat, 700 miles in 52 hours, was made from Custer's last stand by the Bighorn to Bismarck, North Dakota. These 5,000 Indians who were with Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse then went on up into Canada for refuge up there. It was not until the first powwows were here, and they would not let us advertise them, that Indians from the Minnesota River came back to this area from Canada. They were still afraid of reprisals. The second year they would allow us to advertise that they were from coming to the Indian dances at Morton, Minnesota. At the time of Roots, the movie Roots, a 26-year-old Indian girl brought the descendants of the Indian warriors that fought in Custer's last stand back to the Lower Sioux and the Upper Sioux Agency. I had the privilege of taking them up and down the valley to show them where their grandfathers and great-grandfathers fought in the Great Dakota conflict. Many of the 269 prisoners here were women and children. The women spoke highly, many of them spoke highly of their captors, that they were well treated by the Indian people. In fact, they established a relationship between them, a bond. Some of the Indian women testified that the Indians did not violate them in 3 weeks that they were with them, and yet if they testified in favor of this warrior who had not touched them in the 3 weeks, they were still hung at Mankato, Minnesota. The sad part is some of the white husbands, their wives were returned to them, would not accept them back after they had been with the Indians. After they ran out of food in Montevideo, the court-martial was continued again at the Lower Sioux Agency at this site here. still at this point, at this time, there were still 100 Indian warriors sentenced to death, although it was the 39 and finally down to the 38 that were hung on the main street of Mankato. December 26th, 1862. The nation's largest mass hanging, 38 Sioux warriors hung on the main street of Mankato. Dr. Mayo, the first Dr. Mayo, stole the body of Cut Nose at the hanging and used it for research. Camp Pope was established 1 mile northwest of North Redwood, Minnesota on June 16th of 1863. The purpose of the camp was to make certain that all the Indians were driven out of the Minnesota River Valley from here to Ortonville, Minnesota. That was one of the purposes. He established 3,300 men, and starting from this point, they were to march abreast like a giant football team from hilltop to hilltop in the Minnesota River Valley here, 3 feet apart, to make certain that there were no Indians left. So their mission was to go to the Missouri River, and there they were to get the Indians in one giant pinchers and annihilate them. A like group was to come up from Iowa, and they were to get the Indians into one giant pinchers and just eliminate them from the face of the earth. The valley that Sibley and his 3,300 men passed through 3 feet apart on the way to their first camp at Rice Creek Falls. Sibley and his men, who'd left Camp Pope by North Redwood, traveled 7 miles to Rice Creek. Here they camped for the first night. One of the soldiers who was on night sentry duty had a blanket wrapped around himself. It was chilly. When he came back into his camp, his own buddy shot him, thinking he was an Indian sneaking into camp. This is how fearful they were of the Indians coming back to attack again. When Sibley and his men left Rice Creek, they went on up the Minnesota River Valley, just like that giant football team, and they were 3 feet apart going up the Minnesota River Valley. And when they reached the headwaters of the Minnesota at Ortonville, Minnesota, they spread out in one long line, 245 wagons, provisions for 90 days. They headed for the Missouri River, and when they got there, they waited 4 days for a light group to come up from Iowa. The purpose was to catch all of the 5,000 Indians who had left this area in one giant pinchers and annihilate them, just eliminate them. The Iowa group never got there. So the Sibley and his men just had simply one big trip out and back. Now, you want to remember that those Indians had not left the United States until Custer came along in the 1976, which we've talked about. But a year later, also in 1863, Little Crow came back here as a horse thief. And he was stealing a horse at Hutchinson, Minnesota for his people out in the Dakotas. And he was shot by a farmer there. There was a $25 bounty on the farmers, on the Indians. So he went to town to collect his bounty, brought Little Crow in. No one knew that it was Little Crow. They just thought it was another Indian. And so they drug him up and down the main street of Hutchinson, Minnesota, until a Methodist minister came out and said, "That's enough." They threw him on a refuge heap. And when they did, his jaw dropped open. They knew that he had a double row of teeth in his mouth. So then they cut his, and he did. And then they cut his arm open. And he had had a challenge from his brother for leadership, so he'd been shot in the arm. So his wrist forearms were growing solid together. That was positive identification of Little Crow. So then they took the remains of Little Crow, his body, and kept it in St. Paul near the Capitol for 110 years, and then they reburied it out at Flandreau, South Dakota. Now Toya, the fourth great-granddaughter of Little Crow, traveled with me for a year learning the Indian story. She had 4 sons, and one of those sons had a double row of teeth, the same as his fifth great-grandfather. Now here on Cedar Rock Farm, the Indians have returned some 10 years ago. This Cedar Rock and Cedar Mountain are 2 of the sacred peaks in the valley. So they've done the Hablecha, or the 4-day fast out here in this area. And they did this 4 days with no food or water. Now, one of their other visions are to come here and out on the prairie here, out on this prairie land here, they are going to do the powwow, and the powwow would be done as it was years ago. They will have no PAs. The Indians will just be doing it themselves. They will build a shelter of branches and shade out here. And the drummers will be in the center, not on the side. That's what their plans are for in the future. I am Robert Starr from Redwood Falls, Minnesota. Our zip code is 56283. Our phone number is 507-644-3203. I have been a narrator and a tour guide in the Minnesota Valley for the geology and the history of the valley and the Dakota conflict for 40 years. We have taken 30,000 people on tour here. Most tours that we like to take are 3 hours long and tour the most important places. It takes you 3 days to tour the Minnesota River Valley Sioux Uprising. So if you would ever want a tour or anything, you contact us at the address that we just spoke about. Our largest tour was 640 people at one time, 17 buses and 35 cars. We do not like to do this. We only like to take 1 bus load of people at a time, or 1 car load, or 1 van full of people. At about a mile to the northwest here, in the late 1870s, 1780 up to 1790, then Patterson at Patterson Rapids, which stopped all the steamboats in this area, a rock protruding across the Minnesota River, had a fur trading post there. And of course, Lady Astor made a lot of her money out of the Minnesota River Valley because of the extreme fur trade that was west of here, including the Lac of Parle area. But between the 1780s and 1823, when Beltrami came through here, and he took a look at this valley and called it Virtue and Friendship. And while he was doing this, an Indian boy could be born here. In the first 4 days, he would be a Dakota Indian. The first 4 days of his life, he would live on the juice of berries, for his mother's milk would be so rich from the buffalo diet that he would die of the diarrhea. If he was born out in the prairie here or in the valley, at the age of 7, he would never talk to his mother again. For it is now recorded in the world's history that a Dakota Indian or a Sioux Indian born here in southwestern Minnesota is now recognized as the world's bravest man. So how could he be the best cavalryman in the world? By that I mean being brave and also the best horseman. For the Dakota Indians here invented the castrating or the gilding of stallions. For they found out that a gelding had more stamina in battle than a stallion would have. So you can go over into Africa today or northern Africa along the Mediterranean, and they still only allow stallions on the main street, no mares to be seen on the main street where they pull the buggies over there today. But back to this Indian boy, the first 4 days on the juice of berries. And then the next time when he was 7 years old, he would never talk to his mother again in the first person. For if he was going to be this world's greatest cavalryman, he couldn't be hanging onto mother's apron strings. He had to be strong and tough. So then at the age of 12, this Indian boy would be put out on the prairie like this. And if you would look closely in the picture here, you would see blue stem. Blue stem is a native grass, which is some of the best grass and hay available to horses. A horse can travel farther and stronger on this blue stem that's native to Minnesota here than any other grass that he could have in this area. So if he was going to be, he would be put out on the prairie, and it was impossible to live on the prairie alone. You must have a community to live on the prairie here. No one person can live alone and survive, for he needs a community to make things. He'd be left here out on the prairie alone until he got the vision of his life. And the vision of his life could be of what he was going to do in his life. He could get a vision of a white cloud. So when he came back into the council after he decided what he was going to be, he may get the name of White Cloud or any other name that we've all heard the Indians in reference to their own character, their own individual. Not something that your mother or your father put on you, but their own individual character would be their name. So then he could also choose his life's work at this time. He could be a buffalo hunter, he could be a warrior, he could be an arrow maker, or he could be a medicine man. When we say medicine man, it means an awful lot to us. For the only medicine man that I know that is left in this part of the country comes from the Black Hills here to Cedar Rock Ranch, and he does what you call the habletcha here. And the habletcha is the 4-day fast and no food or water for 4 days. And we are pointing the camera at Cedar Rock Ranch and Cedar Mountain are two of the 20 peaks that are over 100 feet high of the oldest chain of mountains in the world. The black granite there being 3 8/10 billion years old, and the world being 4 1/2. So this medicine man, he come from a long line of family blood that had 30,000 years of experience of living on the North American continent. So you had to be very knowledgeable, and a way of passing your information down from one generation of Indians, Dakota Indians, to another by word of mouth. And through the habletcha and through the Sundance and some of those things is how the Indian boys would be selected for their medicine man choice of life. Now, we look in the movies sometimes and we see a medicine man shaking a rattle in front of another person, determining what his sickness or how good his health is. That seems very silly to us. But if you've had experience with livestock or with people or anything, you can take any object and put it in front of that person and watch them very carefully. And by their observation of how they react to a change in sound or in a change in direction by their eyes and their attention, you can tell whether they have high blood pressure or whether they have a temperature, or what is best with that method of finding out what is wrong with them. Most of us think we have to go to the doctor. We have had experience on our farm, and we can tell the temperature of a steer out in the yard before we come and put him in the chute and take his temperature, just by observing how he reacts. So this medicine man was no fool, for in the Minnesota Valley here, we have all of the medicines, 80% of the medicines that the doctors have in their office today. How could we get so many medicines in the Minnesota Valley? They're not out on the prairie. They are only in the valley. How did they get there? If we just make reference to the glacier, the 1 to 2 miles of ice that were overhead, and when they melted and washed this valley out 200 foot deep, 2 miles wide, some 200 miles long as the crow flies, then it was a very good seed bed here. So all the birds that flew from Central America and South America flew up here for their winter home and brought all the seeds and deposited them here in the Minnesota Valley. Then you would find that all of the medicines and every type of plant life that you can think of grows in the Minnesota Valley. There's a Chippewa Indian woman in northern Minnesota at Hinckley that can tell you what all of the different plants are used for and were used for by the medicine man. Now the medicine man would think of, like, aspirin is purely willow bark, and he can go down the line on any of those like that. So that would be the choice of this medicine man young man to be a medicine man. We will take you later up where they do the Hablecha and the Cedar Rock Hill up here. So then this Indian boy, when he had passed through this 12-year-old stage, he would also enter the marrying age, and he would choose his Indian maiden, who would become his squaw or his wife, the same as we do. He would not father a child oftener than once every 3 years from this Indian squaw. For if he did, I put it this way, he couldn't belong to the Rotary Club, the Lions Club, and all the clubs that we have. For the Indian had a wonderful life living with the buffalo here, and when he had gotten the horse, he had much time to perform his dances, his sacred rituals, and their in tune with nature type of religion that they had. So this Indian boy then, on a given notice of 3 hours, a village of 9,000 people could be mobile and ready to move. This Indian boy could not father a child oftener than once every 3 years, for he would be barred from belonging to, shall we say, the long sleeve shirt society, which was the most honored one, and that's the one where you would take care of the family of a fallen warrior before you took care of your own family. And then if you did not do this, you would be barred from any of these activities. Also, you'd be barred from any of these activities if you fathered a child oftener than once every 3 years. For at the age of 3, on this given notice of being mobile and ready to move, you are supposed to be able to go to the bathroom, dress yourself, and feed yourself, and be ready to go. Now, the Indian girls had equally as tough a military type of life, in that they the first 4 days on the juice of berries. And then, of course, when they would first menstruate at the age of 12, this was a public announcement, not like our society, a secret. This was a public announcement. The Indians were very happy that they had a young woman in their family, so they would have a feast and invite everyone over. Then during the first four sick days of this young woman's life, she would spend in a separate tent, never in the family tent, but she would be with her mother. And that's when she would learn the art and the quilling that she learned to do. She learned to do this so well that later in history, the hands of these women were so good that when the United States government, through the Lower Sioux Agency and the Upper Sioux Agency, were teaching the Indians a trade, trying to get the Indian males to be farmers and the women to be lace makers, they had the best lace in the world. So it is Redwood County, Dakota, Sioux Indians who attracted English royalty to Redwood County to see where the best lace in the world was made. And that's because these girls had such excellent ability with their hands to do, they could sew a moccasin watertight. That gives you a little bit about the Indian girls. Then she would choose her husband the same as any of the rest of them, as we do in our society. The Indian had the knowledge of all the plants that we have. He developed corn 5,000 years ago from 2 blades of grass, and the first ear was the size of a thumbnail. And then he developed this corn so that 1 pound of grain would produce, 1 pound of seed would produce 300 pounds of grain. We, in all our technology, taking us back to 30 years ago, upped that 1 pound of grain from 1 pound of seed to 300 pounds of grain, to 1 pound of seed to 400 pounds of grain. So we didn't improve that much over what the Indian did in those years that he was experimenting with producing corn. More recently, we have developed the corn faster with a lot of fertilizer. Now the oats and the wheat and the barley came from Israel, and the wild seeds are still over there. The University of Minnesota and the University of Tel Aviv are protecting those areas so we don't lose those seeds, for they are needed in the development of new seeds all of the time. The same that we are dependent on the Indian in Central America for the native corn that he developed that stood the test of time, not the corn that we have today that doesn't last more than 5 years, and then we have to come up with a new corn. For the Indian had the squash, the pumpkin, and the tomato. And if you remember in your history, the King of France had to publicly sit in the public square and eat a tomato to show people in Europe that the tomato was safe to eat. Also, when you think about the potato, then the Europeans come over here as the early settlers and explorers and brought the potato back to Europe. The potato would keep more people alive on 1 acre of potatoes with a more nearly balanced diet than anything else you could eat. So therefore, the French and the Irish were producing a lot of children and living on the potato, and had a good time until they forgot about the blight. And when the blight hit, more people starved in Europe from not having the potato to eat, the failure of the crop, than any other period in history. So then we will take and show you that on the hills to the north of us is Renville County. In the words of Maynard Speece, a popular WCCO radio announcer, Renville County, land, people, bar none, I will take Renville County. Francis Picquart, in the 1840s, traveled. He was sent over here from France to find Pomace des Prairies, another potato, which was a life-sustaining plant that could just be dug up by the Indians with a stick, and if they didn't want to hunt buffalo, they could then just dig up this plant and eat it, and you could survive on it like a potato. They sent him over here to find this other potato and bring it back to France and Ireland. He traveled the Yellowstone Trail, which is from St. Paul to Sacred Heart through Renville County, and then followed the bluff that you see over here, searching for the seed for Pomace des Prairies. Searching 4 years while people are starving over there and waiting for him to come back with a new seed. And at the end of 4 years, he gave up, and then he brought the whole plant back to France. And then they discovered that Pomace des Prairies only produced seed once every 6 years. The Indians were morally very, very good people. The settlers that came here were very, very good people. The traders and the agents in this area were of another character. So the Indians had one god, Wakan Tonka, that they worshipped. They worshipped the four directions, things of nature, and their medicine man could lead them in these worships and tell them when the deer was spawning and when the fish were spawning. So they had a wonderful way of life, a high price put on virginity. An Indian girl that became pregnant by the first white settlers, or the soldiers that came into this area, commit suicide by jumping off a high rock cliffs here rather than bring the shame back to their family. The second eldest daughter of Chief Wabasha commits suicide by jumping off a high cliff like this after she became pregnant, and the white soldier refused to marry her. At the age of 16 or 17, the Indian family, with their young virgin daughter, would also have another party and invite all of the people in for a feast. And at that time, they would announce that their daughter was a virgin and that she was of marrying age, and it was just a turning point in her life. If anyone challenged that she was a virgin, he had to publicly stand up and bite the knife and then prove his point, and if he couldn't prove his point, he was killed. You did not idly gossip about other people's character as we do and get away with it. There were between 60 and 80 million buffalo on the prairies here, from here west to the Rockies, which provided this wonderful life for the Dakota Indians, who controlled over 5 states for over 100 years, and they had the horse to go get the buffalo. As the white man came here, he shot the buffalo for fur to begin with, for meat, and then finally for sport and for the honor. The first high-honored white buffalo hunters got 60 buffalo with one sitting. The final top buffalo hunter got 120 buffalo with one sitting. And he would do this. He would pick out the lead bull. He would shoot the lead bull in the lungs. The lead bull would sit down and bawl, and the cows would circle around him, and then he would have a deadly shot to the head, He would have to time his shots so he wouldn't melt his gun barrel. So then this is how they destroyed the buffalo and put the Indian in the position of coming to the white people, signing treaties, and then expecting to get their food and clothing, putting them into starvation, degrading them, and of course broke their strong, religious, high moral standard way of living. Understand the settlers also had a very good Christian way of living. This is the Bible belt of the world here, in the wheat belt and the corn belt of the United States. More people go to church here than any place else in the world. And of course the traders and the agents were somewhat of an outlaw type of people and caused all the trouble that finally led to the Indian uprising in 1862, August of 1862. The Dakota Indians did choose this area from Mud Creek, just on this side of New Ulm, partway between Fort Ridgely and Big Stone Lake, the headwaters of the Minnesota. The Minnesota drains 18% of the state here. They chose this beautiful area for their reservation when they signed the treaties of 1851. 10 miles wide on each side of the Minnesota River, a 20-mile strip here is where they wanted to have their home. We are in Delhi Township. All of the water, most of the water from Redwood, Lyon, and Lincoln counties dumps into this township. So there were deep wooded ravines here as the water tumbled the 200 foot down from the prairie into the Minnesota River Valley. The elevation of the river being 800 feet down here. So that's why it created this scenery. And we had the springs here, and we also had a series of little lakes along the Minnesota here, more than in other areas. So they did have wood and water, for this was a treeless plain. Redwood and Renville County are very high in lime, excellent for corn, alfalfa, and beans. But only 6 trees do well here. We have 6 to 7 to 8 parts of lime in this area. And like a Norway pine will only stand 5 points of lime. So that's why there are not many trees in the Minnesota River Valley. And the river bluffs here did not have one tree on them when I was a kid. The only trees were in the deep ravines, or the red cedar were in the 20 mountain peaks along the Minnesota River, and they were protected by fire by the rocks in those peaks. The Dakota Indian religion was outlawed. It's only since 1976 that Congress passed a law that the Indian could now pursue his religion one more time. That is when their powwows started and the beginning of their return to their old religious ways. They still go to church, to the Episcopalian Mission Church at Morton, Minnesota, east of Redwood Falls. You have to remember that when we outlawed their religion, they had to accept our ways before they could get their food and clothing. We could never decide what religion they should have. At Morton it was Episcopalian. At Granite Falls it was Presbyterian. So each place the Indian had to become a different faith of accepting the white man's ways. But since 1976 they've pursued their own ways again. And they do now what you call the Hoblecha, which is one of the first stages of finding leadership or purifying their own bodies and so on. This is a lodge in the background, but right here in the foreground is where the Indian would put up his sweat lodge, his purification lodge. Right over here to my left is the pits where they would heat the rocks and put the rocks into the tent and then put water on them and steam. Then they would go in here and they would pray as we do. The medicine man would be here to supervise this, for they would go 4 days and 4 nights without food or water. They did not do it this year of 1992, for they are also very busy with their Jackpot Junction venture at Morton, Minnesota. But prior to that, they would come from Minneapolis and different places, and the Indians would do the sweat lodge here. Then they would have to spend the night out with no food or water. And of course, at the end of this period, you would be able to tell how much stamina a young man would have. For after that, you would be able to choose amongst us who should also be your leader. I happen to know the farmer out in South Dakota that owns the land, where one of the next steps is that they do the sun dance. Right here, the Indian women could not come and view this. No white person could come and watch them do this. The Indian women could not go into the pipestone quarries years ago, only the men. This gives you a little idea of how strong a belief they had with nature and with Wakantanka, their god. This Hablecha area is on top of Cedar Rock Ranch. We own one of the largest, oldest rocks in the world. If you take a look at one of these old ancient mountain peaks, you'll see it is 23 acres in size, one peak. This is a little larger than the other 19 peaks that are in the Minnesota River Valley. We have had World Convention of Geologists here. The geologist that analyzed the moon rock for Russia was here for 10 days, along with 80 other geologists worldwide. Here they can walk up and touch the black granite. The black granite in these peaks here are 3 8/10 billion years old. The world is 4.5 billion years old. And if you accept the theory that an asteroid hit the Earth here once and so upset the world that it buried the redwood forests out to the west of us and all around the state of Minnesota, and then it exposed this old chain of mountains here. And the reason these old chain of mountains are exposed is because if the asteroid hit the Earth and created dust in the Earth and put us into the Ice Age, and then we had between 1 and 2 miles of ice overhead over Renville and parts of Redwood County, for the glaciers stopped in Redwood County. There were 5 glaciers that covered this area at different periods in history. Renville County doesn't vary more than 100 feet in elevation from one end to the other, whereas Redwood County will vary quite a bit. Now, still accepting that theory that the asteroid hit the Earth here, and when it did, the entire United States was covered with the redwood forest. And when we hit the Ice Age and upset the Earth and buried trees and so on, and buried the redwood forests out in the Dakotas and different places to create coal and oil, then this particular area of Redwood and Renville County, 100 miles wide here, was once like the Rockies. This chain of mountains extends across Minnesota from north to south, centering in the Redwood Falls area, on up into Canada. Nothing ever grew here in the history of the world. Nothing. The redwood forest covered the entire United States, but not this area here. This is the base rock here. That's why we say that you cannot have an earthquake here. So these geologists studying this area here, and Northwestern University brings their geologists up here once a year and keeps them at the Redwood Inn, and then they come out here and view this area. We've already mentioned that the Russian geologists, along with 80 other geologists, have come here twice and studied the rock in this area here. We spend $6 billion each year in the state of Minnesota buying energy. And the energy comes from North Dakota and different parts of the world. The city of Minneapolis and St. Paul could not live more than 30 days without the energy that keeps coming in from North Dakota. For the trains that haul the coal in, night and day, have priority over other trains to get the coal in. The electricity that comes from the Oahe and the Garrison dams on the Missouri River, the Twin Cities couldn't live 30 days without the energy they received from the Dakotas. But the Dakotas could live a long time without the Twin City area. And of course Minnesota had absolutely no energy except a little bit of water power here and there, and then a little bit of wood that we would burn to generate some energy. So taking this into account, how do we get this scenery here? For Ernest Hemingway described it as some of the most beautiful in the world. Beltrami describes it as virtue and friendship, and the scenic things that are in the Minnesota River Valley created by these outcropping of rocks here. And of course you can go south of here 40 miles, and one of these peaks that is exactly like this one is level with the ground in the east of Jeffers, Minnesota, known as the petroglyphs, and the Indian writings in that are before the Ice Age, for the glaciers scratched through them all in one direction. But a little bit more about the geology and the history of here, and when Hemingway called it so beautiful and Beltrami so beautiful, how did we get all this beauty and scenery in this particular area? Why doesn't Marshall or Renville or another area have it? It's only Redwood and Renville County. In the Echo-Delhi area, particularly from Granite Falls to Morton, Minnesota, where the exceeding beauty is in the area. This was the center of the chain of mountains that the water had to cross. Well, if the dust started to settle and the earth warmed up, and we did have between 1 and 2 miles of ice overhead, we had so much of the world's water tied up here that we lowered the ocean levels enough that there was an 85-mile strip of land wide between Alaska and Russia. And where we thought when I was a kid that the horse came over in a Spanish boat, which is true, but the horse was here first, for we didn't find this out until we dug the deep trenches for the Oahe and the Garrison dams. And you can go out to Bismarck, North Dakota today, and those deep core trenches to stop the dams from leaking or prevent them from leaking, they found the dinosaur and the horse together. So when the Ice Age hit us, the dinosaur being a large animal and could not move, the horse being very mobile, walked from Alaska to Russia and then come back in a Spanish boat later in history. So as this warming period began, then the Red River of the North flows from Ortonville on up through Winnipeg via the Red River of the North, the only river that flows north. And of course with all the ice there, it couldn't possibly, no water could get out of there. As the melting took place, it built up a lake on the west side of Minnesota, an ancient lake called Lake Agassiz. And that was 300 miles wide, some 400 miles long, extending on up into Winnipeg. Then finally this lake covered several provinces in Canada. Eventually, this huge amount of water had to go someplace. So it started trickling down from Ortonville, Minnesota in just a little tiny creek. And then as it washed more and more and erosion took place, like with one flush of the toilet, it eroded the Minnesota Valley out from Ortonville to Mankato to St. Paul, 200 foot deep, 200 miles long, 2 miles wide, took all the dirt down to the Delta in New Orleans, and they are raising soybeans on Minnesota land down in the New Orleans area. When it did that, it exposed this oldest chain of mountains in the world, and there are about 20 peaks, and that's why the geologists come here to view them and to study them, for this is the one place that you can walk up, put your hand on black granite, and you can't touch anything older in the world. Now, the University of Wyoming received a grant to make a study up here, and they have wired the ground every 100 feet for 17 miles from Cedar Rock Ranch east and west, and they are trying to unlock the history of the world from 3 8/10 billion to 4 1/2 billion years, the age of the Earth. So our great-grandchildren are supposed to know at some time what happened in the world between that period of time, for we don't know what happened in that period in history. Now, if you think of turning your television set on in the summertime, and you turn it on and it says Redwood Falls 90, 95, and even up to 108 and 110 at times, the hottest place in the state of Minnesota. Why would it be so particularly hot here? The river drains 18% of the state. There's 1 4/10 of fall per mile in this particular area. And at Patterson Rapids right west of here, the steamboats were stopped. But all of the water from Redwood and Renville County, or from Redwood, Lincoln, and Lyon counties dumps into Delhi Township by Cedar Rock here. And when it cuts through this valley, it drops it 200 foot deep down to the 800 foot level of the river. A drop of water 80 miles west of here, falling on the South Dakota Minnesota border, drops 1,000 feet to 1,200 feet. When it gets here to Delhi Township, it drops another 200 feet into the river valley here. From here, it only drops 800 feet all the way to New Orleans. That's why the Indians chose this area to live, because it cut such deep gorges from the prairie down to the river bottom here, leaving a lot of springs and a little lakes along the river here. And in these deep ravines is the only place there was wood and spring, and animals would also come in here. So it was a great place for the Indians to winter, such as Rice Creek or Rice Creek Falls, where they had open water, wood, and could find small game animals in the deep ravines here. There were no trees out on the prairie, so they had to come to this area. It even affected the hobo life later in history when the railroads come, for the hobos would go into the Redwood River Valley where they had wood and water, and of course close access to a town in case they needed to get food. But also they had fishing and could cook their own food, and they were out of the wind in these places. A great place to camp for people all through the history of our time. Following up a little bit more on why it was so warm here, in Delhi Township, where all this water dumps in here, we are at about 1,020 feet on the prairie. If we go over towards the petroglyphs, we run up to about 12 to 1,400. We get over to Tracy, it's 1,400 feet higher. 1,400 feet high, the elevation. Get over to Lind over in there, it is 1,800 feet high. To the South Dakota border, it is 2,000 feet high. So we have to the south of us what is known as the Buffalo Ridge or the Red Rock Ridge. That area has two names for it, all sloping down towards Delhi Township or Redwood County. Then to the north of us, we have the Glacial Ridge Trail. You can read about it when you read the bronze plaques up by Belgrade, Bruton, and Glenwood. Again, an area in Renville County, sloping down to the Minnesota River via the Hawk Creek area, where it is dumped in by the Middle Creek and the Beaver Falls, all in this one area, these deep ravines and creeks flowing in here. Redwood and Renville have more corn acres than any other two counties combined. We have up to 500,000 acres of corn in these two counties. It takes a lot of heat, and of course we get the heat here, so we lift out of the ground more tons of material than any other two counties around. In this 21 county area of southwestern Minnesota, we have more tractors per square mile, over 100 horsepower, than any place in the world. So it is a very intense agricultural, soybean, corn, alfalfa producing area, and it used to be great for wheat in this particular area. If we go another 10 miles east of here, we would come to the Morton area or the Rainbow Granite. Most of these areas do have some rainbow granite in it. The Morton quarry is the only rainbow granite quarry around. When the derrick was put up at Morton, Minnesota, in the Rainbow Granite Quarry, that was the second tallest derrick in the United States. And with it they quarried the deepest quarry in the United States. So from Renville County, they ship out granite, and it's used as a building granite. And the post offices in Los Angeles and San Francisco are covered with this granite. Two of the largest pieces of granite taken out are fountains on the White House lawn in Washington, D.C. The new FBI building in Washington, D.C. is covered with this granite. It is 4 colors. It's a mixture where the volcanoes broke through, and like mixing cake batter, it mixed 4 colors together. Now, when Pennsylvania built their capital, then they got the rainbow granite, and then they come back for another $1 million worth of rainbow granite for their parking lot. That was the end of all large quarrying done in Morton, Minnesota. They still quarry there. They have quarried all through the years, non-stop, even in the Depression. But they will not take on such huge projects because they are too big and too huge to handle and too much of a strain to get all of the granite out of the area. When the Minnesota River was cutting its way through here, it had to cut between some of the mountain peaks. So to the west of us here is a place called Deep Eddy, and there is the deepest hole in the Minnesota River, 75 foot deep. The water having to go through such close confined area, it would naturally dig a hole on the low side, so that was a very popular fishing spot. Now, in this particular area, of course, it was great for clam shells, it was great for walleye and northern fishing, until the Germans, like myself, came in here and put carp in here in 1880. But otherwise, with the 1 4/10 of fall per mile, it was ideal walleye and northern fishing area. The rock peaks were a natural barrier for fire. So the red cedar survived, and the red cedar is natural to this area, the juniper tree. So they have always been here. It's only in recent years, during the 1930s, the river bluffs themselves were trumped black by sheep and cattle of the settlers. And then we had the wet 40s, and the birds transplanted the seed over there. So the river bluffs are now covered with trees, red cedar, and they were bare some 40 years ago. They were simply just bare, no trees at all on the river bluffs. Indian maidens that got in trouble with white soldiers and that refused to marry them jumped off of the high rock cliffs like this and commit suicide. And of course, in 25 years' time, we demoralized them, and they no longer followed their old strict high values of religion that they had. At one time, all of the rock peaks in the Minnesota River Valley were owned by farmers, and they were pastured around them. Today, most of the rock peaks are owned by businessmen and sportsmen. The rock peaks are also used for trail riders. Many trail riders, 200 and 300 at a time, come from all parts of the state to go trail riding and view the beautiful scenery in the Minnesota River Valley north of Redwood Falls, Minnesota. This is September of 1992. When James Michener wrote his book Centennial for the bicentennial, he had 3 geologists hired for a year, and they studied this area, and then they moved the book and the story to Colorado, but they wanted to start with the most base thing in the world, and so they came here and studied this area here. Ripe plums in the Minnesota Valley, September 1992. Take a left turn to the west at the Gold Mine Bridge. Follow the road back in for a mile on a little narrow graveled road, township road. The Rice Creek crossing on the way to Gold Mine. The road between Rice Creek and the outlet to Gold Mine. The outlet from Gold Mine Lake. The road crossing. Gold Mine Lake from the southeast corner. The path leading to the gold mine shaft. The gold mine shaft, as it was left for the last time in 1896, 126 foot deep. This is the slag pile, the material that they did not use that was chipped out of the 126-foot deep mine shaft going 60 feet under the lake. And this is the latest essay on just what they threw away here is $95 a ton. Now this is chipped by hand by miners in 1894. We begin our story in 1894 right by Gold Mine Lake here, which we see over to our right a little bit. This is the entrance to Gold Mine Lake, a newly built township road, a beautiful little spring-fed lake where many of the local residents went swimming here for years. If you came here at 1 o'clock in the afternoon on a hot day, you would not get home until 6 o'clock that night because there would be a traffic jam behind you. But let's stay with our story of the gold mine itself. The gold mine was started in 1894 by Mr. Erickson and Mr. Webster of Marshall. Mr. Erickson was from Minneapolis. And it was not uncommon for 300 people to come by buggy and stage from Redwood Falls down here to the gold mine. So the gold in the gold mine was assayed, and it is always assayed the same as the Homestake mine in the Black Hills. The gold was taken out of the shaft here, and it was taken by a little narrow gauge railroad track that ran along the side of the mountain, and we will swing around to see if we can pick up the area that the gold mine road was on. The gold mine little narrow gauge railroad running back to the crushing plant. This is the trail to the crushing plant. These are the foundations of the old crusher that was run by a steam engine. And this is where the narrow gauge railroad track brought the rock out to be crushed and dumped into the Minnesota River. And the attempt was made to get the gold out here. It failed because they did not have the acid method of getting the gold out like they did later in history when the Homestake mine in the Black Hills was being used. Since they were dumping the slag and the crushed rock into the Minnesota River over there and losing it, obviously they were not able to pay their miners. So it was short-lived, only about a year, the first time of mining gold down here. But this was Redwood County's most romantic episode in its entire history. For a boom town sprung up here known as Springville. And at Springville they had two hotels and a livery barn and dances every Saturday night. And then it is reported that even prostitutes, ladies of the evening, were brought by railroad out to Morton, Minnesota, and then by stage and buggy to Delhi on the Saturday nights. In the old gazettes there was articles always printed about razzing somebody in Redwood Falls on being sure that they made it out to the gold mine dances on Saturday night. Now, also the miners protested the drinking of the gold mine lake water. And the water was sent into a university of Minnesota, and we did have a university at that time, and it was declared pure enough to drink. So therefore, before the swimming pools in town and refrigeration, you're talking about in the 1910, 20, and 30 period, then the only place that you could possibly cool off was in Gold Mine Lake. For in the Redwood-Renville County area, it was the only lake in the whole country that remained pure all summer. It is a very deep lake. Right ahead of the camera here is where everyone went in swimming. It's a sand bottom there, and it's a gradual slope until you get to 6 feet, and then it drops off. We are supposed to know how deep it is, but no one really knows how deep it is. It's a very, very deep lake, and it stays pure all of the summer for swimming. Now that the Delhi Township Board has renewed and upgraded the road in here, many people are coming to revisit the old gold mine area. There are parties held down here. There's been champagne for 30th wedding anniversaries. Many events are held down here this year. The gold mine area was a very exciting time, and the shaft being 120 foot deep and going down onto the lake has never been pumped out or found out what it was. Harold Molstead has the grinder, to sharpen the tools that were used down here. I'm Bob Starr. I have the anvil that was used down here to pound out the tools on it. So through the years, it's been one of Minnesota's Redwood County area's most popular spots to come down here and to enjoy yourself. We will now go up on top of the high rock hill that's behind us. This is one of 20 of the old mountain peaks that are in the Minnesota River Valley. That's the oldest chain of mountains in the world. The trail to the top of Gold Mine Mountain Peak behind Gold Mine Lake. Just above the gold mine shaft itself is the Gold Mine Old Mountain Peak. It's very beautiful up here. You can see the lake down below. And of course the shaft is just below where we're standing here. That's why people come up here. As many as 200 and 300 horses have come up here on top, rode over the top, and enjoyed the scenery that's up here. You get a very good view of the Minnesota River Valley. As you swing the camera around, you'll find there's ever so much to feast your eyes on for scenery around here. We are in about the center of 20 of the only mountain peaks in the Minnesota River Valley that are over 100 feet high. And if we notice that we are just between the Minnesota River itself and Gold Mine Lake, and if we can get a view of the river here, then we will tell you about another industry that was down here, and it is the clamshell. We are the clamshell capital of the United States. This may not seem like much to you, but if you look in your mother's button box, you'll find that these two little holes in the clamshell, buttons were taken out of here, and that's what she used for many years as buttons for your grandfather's shirt and all the dresses that they had. Many people, the first money that they got in this area was coming down to the Minnesota River and looking for clamshells. The river here is the fastest flowing part of the river. The Minnesota River drains 18% of the state, and of course it comes off of a high area, 1,000 feet higher here to the west of us, 80 miles, and then it only drops another 1,000 feet from here to New Orleans. So due to this rock formations in the river valley, we have 1.4 feet of fall here per mile, whereas at New Ulm or Mankato they only have 0.4 feet of fall. So this is ideal walleye and northern fishing area. Also nice sand bottom and the rocks for the clamshells. So they were shipped by the carloads from Echo, Bellevue, Delhi, and North Redwood. They were shipped to Gutenberg, Iowa, and there they were made into the buttons that we showed you a minute ago. If you dig a backhoe down in Gutenberg, Iowa, and going to build a new house, you would probably come up with clamshells before you find a place to dig on solid ground, for so many of them were shipped there. Now, about the time in the late 30s, then the clamshell industry died out because Henry Ford was so proud to come with a plastic made from soybeans trying to help the farmer out. After all, he invented his car to burn entirely on alcohol. And then at the same time, Zipper invented the zipper, and of course there was no need for the clamshell buttons out of the Minnesota River after that. You're looking over towards Renville County to the northwest of us here, and it is one of the richest counties in the state, but Renville and Redwood County are very rich in history in this area here. So we will end our gold mine story here, letting you know that it's a very scenic spot, a wonderful place to come on a Sunday afternoon to enjoy yourself. A good example of quartz carrying gold in the gold mine hill. It's in the quartz that you find the gold. Zimmerly Park at the north end of Gold Mine Lake.